This is a real Shehechianu moment, and we will end our interview with a Shehechianu prayer. Rabbi Jo David, here we are at the Berkeley College. It's a long trip from your beginning at the Academy in 1988.
Yes.
What prompted you to choose the Academy back then?
I thought I was going to Hebrew Union College. When I decided to go to rabbinical school in 1983, I joined Central Synagogue here in New York with my husband, Neil Yerman, and we became very involved in synagogue life. It was the first time that I had ever really been involved in a synagogue, and I was very much inspired by Rabbi Sheldon Zimmerman, who was there at the time, and also Rabbi Lynn Landsberg, who was there and was one of the first generation of female rabbis. And at the time, I didn't really know of any other place to go. I felt I was absolutely committed to Reform Judaism, and so Hebrew Union College was the only place to go. By the time that I applied to Hebrew Union College, I knew a little bit more about the Jewish world, but they rejected me on the first time, and they told me that despite the fact that I had a long career in advertising and had run my own business, a multi-million-dollar business that I built myself, they felt that I was not perhaps academically prepared for their rigorous course, and they told me to go and get a master's degree. At that time, I had met someone who had had a similar experience, and she had gone to NYU and gotten a master's there in Judaic studies. And so I thought, and then she got in. So I thought, okay, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to NYU, I'm going to go and get a master's in Jewish studies, and then they'll accept me. Well, this was at a time, this was 1986. In 1986, Hebrew Union College and to some extent JTS, which was not yet, which had just started ordaining women by 86, they weren't taking old students. Old meant past undergraduate college age, and I was in my early 30s, as was this woman who had the same experience that I had. And I didn't understand at the time, because they don't tell you why they reject you. I didn't understand that I could have been the greatest chacham in the world and they wouldn't have taken me. But they did me a favor, and I did go to NYU. And I went to NYU for Judaic Studies in the year that it became part of the graduate division of art and science, and they brought in to the Skirball Department of Judaic Studies these amazing teachers. Dr. Baruch Levine, who became my mentor and thesis advisor, Dr. Cyrus Gordon, who was ending his career at that time, who was still teaching, and my advisor was Lawrence Hoffman, who wasn't yet, Lawrence Schiffman, who was not yet Lawrence Schiffman of the Qumran fame, but was well on his way to being it. I just didn't know it, and he didn't like me because he didn't believe women should be rabbis, but that's another story. But I had a fantastic experience at NYU. So something to study with Baruch Levine and Cyrus Gordon was a miracle, and gave me such a fantastic foundation for rabbinical school, one that other students didn't have if they didn't have that kind of training. Dr. Gordon, in the first day that I sat in his class of about 400 students, wrote something on the board in some language I didn't know, turns around and says, "Harlan, what's wrong with this?" And I'm thinking, Harlan, what's wrong with this? What is this? And at that moment, I knew this was going to be a unique experience, and it was. It really was. So I got through, I did straight A's in my master's. I did a thesis on death and mourning rituals as seen through the eyes of the 6th century prophets that Dr. Levine mentored me with. And by this time I knew that if I didn't go to HUC, that the academy existed. In 1986, when I first applied to Hebrew Union College, I didn't know that. And I was devastated. But my Hebrew teacher at Hunter College, when I went to tell her that I hadn't been accepted, she said, "Oh, there's another school that's a liberal seminary." I said, "No, I don't think so." And she said, "Yes, one of my students went there." And to this day, I don't know who it was. But she told me about the academy. And of course, this is pre-internet. This is pre-everything. But I looked around and I found the academy. And in 1986, I spoke to Shohama. So I knew that the academy was there as a backup. I had thought briefly about going to RRC, but they wouldn't let me commute. And I couldn't be in residence because at that time, Neil, my husband, was starting a new business as a calligrapher and scribe, and he needed me to be there with him. So, so I wasn't going there. So when HUC rejected my application the second time, I immediately called Shohama and said I'd like to apply. And I was concerned because I was a Reform Jew. I wanted to teach in Reform communities. And I said to my mother, I'm concerned that I'll never work because HUC controls all the jobs and AJR no one knows. And she said, so you'll work with them so that they'll get better known. And that was really my focus from the day I started at the academy. Not only to be a student, but to help the school in whatever way I could to get it better known so that graduates from the academy would have better opportunities for job placement.
You said you were afraid that you wouldn't be able to be a Reform Jew.
Right.
Did you know that AJR was a pluralistic institution, and did that mean anything to you?
It didn't mean anything to me at the time. What was important to me was that I knew that it wasn't Reform, but the fact that it was also not conservative, not Orthodox, not Reconstructionist, was interesting to me. It wasn't until I became a student there that I really began to appreciate what that might mean to me in terms of the development of my rabbinate and how much it would enrich my rabbinate, because the experience of being in a setting where you are learning from people from all different backgrounds and you're learning with people from all different backgrounds is amazing. You know, at HUC, everybody is the same, and if they're not the same, they're pushed to be the same, unfortunately. At the academy, that wasn't true. There was this sense of openness, sometimes leading to confusion. I remember one day very early in my first semester when there was something going on in Israel. And Rabbi Manny Gold came, and of course, because there was something going on in Israel, he taught about it from his Reform perspective. And then Rabbi Hillel Silverman, a conservative rabbi, came in and talked about Israel from the conservative, his perspective. And then Meir Fund, a Hasidic rabbi, came in and talked about what was happening in Israel from his perspective. And it wasn't planned, it just happened, unfolded that way. And I think I was not alone in the feeling that my head was going to explode. But it was a real paradigm of what happened, what would happen at the academy, and it was a good thing. You know, sometimes your head needs to explode. And also, at that time, there were very, very few students. Students who go to the academy today have a very different experience. They have a choice of classes. They have people in different grades, in different levels of learning. When I started in 1988, I think there were 5.5 students enrolled, the half being someone who was very part-time. And we had a student who came in every week from Los Angeles and stayed at the plaza, and she would come and then she would work. She'd come for 2 days and then she'd go back and she'd worked with someone there and then she would go back and forth. So she was also not around very much. So there were only not even a handful of us in any one class, which meant that whatever was being taught, and that's what you took. So my first quarter my first semester at AJR, I studied codes with Sammy Barth, intermediate Talmud with Isaac Mann, introductory Hebrew, or I guess it was kind of intermediate Hebrew because we all had to have a certain level of Hebrew proficiency. So it was but modern Hebrew. We had a course in the Jewish calendar, which was really about Midrash with Meir Fund. And so there were a lot of different, and we had a course in Reform liturgy with the great Chaim Stern. So that would be a lot for anybody, but for someone coming in with very little background, relatively speaking, especially the intermediate Talmud, it was a lot. It was a lot, and I began to realize very early on in that semester, that if I wanted to get through the next, at that time it was 4 years, if I wanted to get through the next 4 years, I was going to have to basically be very thankful that I was married and say goodbye to all my friends. Because dealing with these texts in Hebrew was very challenging. My Hebrew was not terrific, but you know, and of course, then there's the Aramaic for the Talmud, and it's not a nice introductory course in Talmud, but now I had already studied some Talmud with Rabbi Zlotowitz at Central Synagogue. He had a Friday morning class that was amazingly well attended, that had been going on for years, and one of the first things that I did was to participate in that, and that was a wonderful experience. But it was also not fundamentals of Talmud. We were going through, making our way through Barachot, and it was wonderful, and I met some fabulous people, and we would go and we would daven first, and then we would have a l'chaim. Bernie Silverman of blessed memory, one of the stalwarts of Central Synagogue, kept a bottle of schnapps behind the little ark in the little chapel and the little cups, courtesy of the men's club. And after Friday morning minyan, they had a daily minyan at Central Synagogue. And he would take this out, and we'd all have a l'chaim, then we'd go downstairs, and whoever else was around at 8 o'clock, from 8 to 9, we'd study Talmud with Rabbi Zlotowitz. So I had some introduction, but not much. And Isaac Mann, whom I knew previously because he's a book dealer also on the side, and my father and brother owned a rare and out-of-print book business. I knew him from that part of my life. So I could tell him that I was not having an easy time. And then there was Joe Topek, who was the head of Hillel at Stony Brook and still there, who had a day school education. So, and there were a couple of people who also had much more experience with texts than I did. And the wonderful thing about that class was that Rabbi Mann had the facility to understand where each person was in that class. I mean, there were only 3 or 4 of us. So I did the assignments as best I could, and he understood that. And he appreciated that. I worked very hard, but I didn't have the background, especially intermediate Hebrew. It's intermediate Talmud. I mean, I was learning to use all the different resources and learning to read Rashi script and, all of the things that go along with learning Talmud. But I was this wasn't going to get me down. However, there's a moment which is burned in my memory, and which I shared with Rabbi Mann some years later. There was a point one day at which my brain turned off. And those of us who've been in these classes, these heavy text classes, we know what this is like. But I was only maybe I was a week into my first semester in rabbinical school. And I was terrified because I realized if I couldn't get through Talmud, I was never going to become ordained. And I didn't know what to do when literally my brain, I couldn't understand anything that was being said, and it was being said in English. And then I looked up, and at that time we were at Anshe Chesed, and the room that we used was used as a shelter for homeless people during the night. But it was a classroom, and it had windows, and it overlooked the backs of other buildings. You could see what was going on. And because I couldn't track anything, I kind of stared out the windows. And what do I see as I stare out the windows but dozens and dozens of pigeons? And as I looked at the pigeons, I realized that there was amorous activity going on. And so I watched the pigeons. I'd never seen pigeons mating. I'd never seen pigeons doing their mating dances. I had never seen pigeons. One of the things that male pigeons do is they may approach a female, but if the female doesn't show interest, they kind of get confused and walk away. It's very, very funny. And so I kind of observed this in this somewhat altered state of mind for a while. And then I realized that I was able to come back to class mentally and focus on what was going on. And so from that point on, when Talmud got to be too much, I would watch the pigeons. And I passed the course. And so when I told this to Isaac Mann a number of years later, we agreed that obviously pigeons had a higher meaning and a higher purpose than just flying around New York State. They were obviously made to help me get through Talmud.
So Those are very challenging times. We all have gone through that type of thing. What would you say were some of the most precious teachings that you picked up along the way from this very rich blend of faculty and students?
When I started rabbinical school, or when I was thinking about starting rabbinical school, actually, before I did my master's, I had never read the Torah. I had no background in Jewish texts at all. It wasn't part of my background. And I guess I thought, well, I'll read the Torah, I'll read the Hebrew Bible because I have to, and I'll figure it out as I go along. It wasn't really text study was not what motivated me to enter the rabbinate. I wanted to work with people in the special way that rabbis work with people. When I got to NYU, that changed, because between working with Cyrus Gordon and working with Baruch Levine, who told us that the reason that he became an expert in Leviticus was because if the temple got built in his lifetime, he wanted to be the one to tell them what to do. I gained an appreciation of these texts that I had never had before, and a great beauty. And I remember once reading the story in Genesis where Jacob has had his dream and he wakes up and he said, God was in this place and I didn't know it. But reading that, I was reading it in Hebrew, and all of a sudden it was like the words literally jumped off the page and became part of me. And I think about this in relation to something that Mel Brooks wrote. Mel Brooks was asked, as the 2,000-year-old man, how they found God. And he talks about this man named Phil who was bigger and stronger, and anybody who didn't do what he wanted, he hit him over the head, or he assaulted them, something like that. And one day a lightning bolt comes out of the sky and knocks Phil out and kills him. And everybody looks up and says, there's something bigger than Phil. Well, that moment of experiencing the text in that way was that moment for me. There's something bigger than Phil. There's something going on in these texts that has something to do with the words, but something to do with something else. And there was another connection when I was at Central Synagogue. When I was first at Central Synagogue before I went to rabbinical school, I wanted to have a bat mitzvah because I had never had one, and I worked for a year to learn my Torah portion. I sang 7 aliyahs. I chanted 7 aliyahs. I learned the trope. I learned the trope for the Haftarah. I chanted the Haftarah. And when I stood in front of the Torah to chant my Torah portion, I had this experience of feeling that a hand was coming out of the ark and putting itself on my shoulder. It was visceral, this connection with the text. It was the first time. I'd never experienced anything like that before, but it was the kind of thing, it's the kind of thing that you say, oh, it didn't happen, right? It was real. I could not reject it. And so that also gave me an intimation that these texts and the scrolls and the history, that there was something there for me that was very special and something that I needed to pursue. so those were important moments for me. As far as being in the classroom, one of the things that I remember to this day was Jeff Hoffman teaching us Midrash and teaching us the story about God offering the Torah to all the different peoples in the ancient Near East until he gets to the Jews and basically says, "You're taking the Torah." And I love that story. And I've used that story in so many different ways, shading it depending on the audience. I've used it with Christian audiences a lot to explain, to help them explain, to help them understand the chosen doesn't mean necessarily superior. You know, I have to leave out some of the anti-Jewish and anti-non-Jewish jokes, but in that midrash, but still the idea is, the basic idea is there, that sometimes you don't have a choice. You know, chosenness can mean that you could choose, but you really can't choose. And it's so much easier if you go along with the direction. So that was a very important moment. I also remember learning about the Shehechianu and using the Shehechianu when you wear new clothing for the first time. And that's something that I do to this day. It's a practice that I took on. It's a practice I teach when I teach conversion students and B'nai Mitzvah students, because I think it's such a beautiful concept to be so thankful for everything that's given to you, and to voice that, and to let others know that you're voicing that to show your appreciation.
It sounds like your spirituality really blossomed, that perhaps at the very beginning you were looking for something a little bit more rational,
Mm-hmm.
and you were open to the possibilities. What did AJR do to create a space that made it safe to do that?
It's a great question. The fact that we didn't have an approved theology, if you will, was very important to that. One of the great things about AJR then was that there were no boundaries. There were no parameters. Everything was very wide open, and that was a benefit, and it was also an institutional issue. Okay, so it was a mixed blessing. But on the blessing side, the good blessing side, was that it made it possible for a student to not have to define himself or herself as a particular type of Jew. So if I found something in Meir Fund's teaching that appealed to me, I could incorporate that. And if I found something in Reform Judaism as being taught by Chaim Stern that I didn't agree with, I didn't have to accept it. That's tremendously important in terms of a person being able to see what works for them and to explore their own spirituality. On the negative side, it meant that there were no rules, there were no boundaries. I'm still waiting for Sammy Barth to give us something that he promised us in my first quarter, my second semester in the Shulchan Aruch class. And teachers could get away with that. They'd say, I'm going to give you this, and then it just never appeared. There were no grades, really, to speak of. I mean, I think some teachers graded some things, but, and there was no concept of institutional organization. so that worked, actually, in some ways it worked, especially in the middle to late 80s, in that it made it possible for people who were students there to do things the way they would like to do, kind of write their own program. We were also, I think, educationally at that time in the 80s, we were in the middle of a movement in higher education that people would write their own programs, that they would craft their own degree. There was a lot of that kind of thing going on, and AJR was very much in touch with that. But I think it also had some negative effects. For example, my admissions interview consisted of one of the older alumni who was a faculty member, and I forget his name now, he's since passed away, but he came in late. He looked at me and he said, "You're in." Didn't ask me any questions. That was it. He said, "I looked in your eyes and we want you." Well, in one way, that's nice. I looked in your eyes and we want you. But I think when you're going to rabbinical school, you want a little more seriousness. You want to know you passed the test, especially someone like me who had been turned down by HUC twice after these two excruciatingly long interviews, in which it became clear afterwards that they didn't value what I brought to them. I have to say that at one point, because of Neil's work, we went to a CCAR convention, and I got to meet a lot of reform rabbis out of HUC. And Neil, at one point, whispered to me and said, "Could you really see yourself as being part of this group?" And the answer was no. Because the kind of regimentation that was required to be a Reform congregational rabbi and what you were supposed to think and what you were supposed to do, not for me. Now, maybe had I gone there, had they taken me in 1986 or even in 88 when I was in my mid-30s, maybe I would have found a way to fit in. But I suspect that I would not have enjoyed my time there. Whereas I have to say that the 4 years that I spent at AJR, although it was excruciatingly difficult for me because my Hebrew skills were not as strong as I had wished they might have been. And so every assignment was just hours and hours and hours, was nevertheless a fabulous time in my life. Where I was meeting interesting people, we were doing interesting things. I was, as time went on, I became more and more involved in helping to support Shoham administratively and in helping to envision a different future for the academy, or a more institutional future for the academy. And I couldn't have done that at HUC. They would not have been open to it. It's the institution is the institution. And so ultimately I ended up in the right place. Although it was difficult, employment was difficult. After I graduated in 92, but during the time that I was in school even, there was a lot of active agitation from people in the reform movement attached to HUC against the academy. And that made it difficult for our students. However, interestingly, those students, including myself, who ended up working in Reform congregations, did extraordinarily well, despite the fact that they were not CCAR members. And the CCAR, every 10 years or so, we would try to get somebody in, and very strong candidates, and they would put them through, make them go through hoops, and then reject them. And it was crazy because they were in significant congregations, and you would think it would be better to permit them to come in and have them join the fold instead of having an allegiance to another organization. But they never saw it that way. Yeah. Even when Rabbi Sandy Olshansky was admitted this year, I mean, you could hear it in the heavens. They said, now this doesn't set a precedent. God forbid they should set a precedent to admit our graduates, despite the fact that now we have, they always said, well, it's because you don't give a master's. So now we're giving a master's. We've been giving a master's for some time, right? I had a master's. What does that say? If you have a master's from NYU, one of the greatest colleges in the country, so what does it matter if you didn't get it from your, seminary? So, I think that was very difficult and has been difficult. I think it's becoming perhaps less difficult because all the placement aspects, groups of the different seminaries are having trouble placing their own people because there are no jobs and because of the economy. So, it's a different time, and perhaps there will be changes or other ways to think about how placement works and who is in, and a lot of the a lot of alumni don't pay. They pay very high dues at HU if you're part of the CCAR, the RA. Very high dues, and a lot of rabbis are opting out. Congregations are opting out of institutional membership because they can't afford to support these enormous institutions. So it's a very different landscape today.
Now, you went in '88. That was about the time that the Cantors came.
That's
in.
right.
So that's a different landscape also.
That's right. Leslie Millman, as she was then, Leslie Friedlander now, I think she came in the second semester that I started, 89. I think she might have come in maybe for a couple of courses in the fall, winter of '88. But she worked with Shohama, and I think Ken Cohen, I think she knew Ken Cohen, to actually establish the cantorial program. So, she and Susan Alcott were the first graduates. And that was a tremendous bonus, I think, to not only to the school, but to the rabbinical students. Because the idea that you would study, the cantors and rabbis would study together, and that we would get, that the rabbis could take cantorial courses, the cantors could take the rabbinics courses. First of all, it gave both the rabbinical and the cantorial students additional skills so that you could go out and be a kolbo and know what you were doing. This is very important. But also it gave us a broader understanding of the Jewish world and Jewish culture and synagogue life and all these things that in other places, in other seminaries, they keep the two tracks totally separate. And as a result, the rabbis and the cantors don't really have very good relationships. And I've seen this over and over again. I remember before I went to rabbinical school, Neil and I were down in Florida for a family affair. And we went to a big Reform shul. It was a Friday night service, and the rabbi and the cantor, who were, yes, maybe in their late 50s, early 60s, came in together, both of them singing in harmony. And this was a Reform synagogue. It was clear they had been working together forever. It was clear that they respected one another. And it was so beautiful. And I thought, that's the model, where the rabbi and the cantor could sing together, you know, and where that's appreciated, where they both appreciate that. And so when the cantorial program was started, we had that opportunity. What it meant in a practical way, when I went out to work in a congregation where I worked actually with a cantor from HUC, student cantor from HUC, was that I was totally unprepared for the cantor's unwillingness to work with me as a partner. And with the students, I was an ordained rabbi by that time, but this person's attitude was that he was the cantor, and I shouldn't have anything to say about the music, and I shouldn't. Now I'm a musician, so I was going to have a lot to say about the music wherever I was, but I felt there should be collaboration, and he wanted his turf. It was a real shock to me to find that kind of situation. My first pulpit after graduation was with Sue Alcott, and that was my best year in the rabbinate. Absolutely my best year. It was so wonderful working with someone who had the same training, who understood that we had a team, and it worked to our advantage and to the congregation's advantage, although they perhaps didn't realize it, because Sue was conservative. I was still more Reform, a little more liberal. It was a non-affiliated Reform breakaway congregation that we were working with. And Sue wanted all the B'nai Mitzvah kids to learn about kashrut. Now this was a synagogue that had no interest in kashrut. And the one time that I tried to suggest that we have some kind of kashrut policy, something, right? Not even what it was going to be. It was such a big deal at the board meeting. Such a big deal. So what Sue and I decided was that since she was the cantor, and she had these kids to herself once a week, she would, as part of their B'nai Mitzvah training, teach them all about kashrut, and they had to bring kosher snacks, and they had to, so that's how they learned about this. And we also, she did a marvelous job. All of our students learned Torah trope, and they all chanted a significant part of their Torah portions. Because Sue was totally committed to that, and I could be totally committed to that. And I wanted that. But if I had said that, they would have said, no, the rabbi is making us do all these things. But the cantor, the cantor in the congregational mind does not have the same authority. And therefore, we figured out very quickly that we could get away with a lot more traditional behavior and teaching if Sue did it. So that's what we did. And it worked wonderfully. And we had a great year together. And the only reason that I left that congregation was because it was part-time. They didn't want to go full-time, and I needed a full-time job. And that's when I went to Freeport and started working with cantors from HUC. So, but that's the cantorial program.
So that must have made very interesting retreats to have cantors and rabbis and no boundaries.
Yes, yes. Actually, the way the retreats started, I think it was the first year. I think it was in 19 either the fall of 92 or the fall of 93 that several of us went to Shohama and said we should have a retreat. We had alumni meetings to which students were invited while I was in school, and we had several of these in different parts of the country, but we'd never had a school-oriented retreat to which alumni were invented. And we went to Shoham and we said, we think we need a retreat program. And it should be a retreat program where there's programming for students, programming for the alumni, separate programming for the alumni, and, you know, some kind of entertainment on, you know, as part of this. And the first one that we did was, I think, up at Camp Isabella Friedman, up in Brewster area. And we had our first cabaret. And at that cabaret, Susan and I did a ventriloquist act where I sat on Susan's lap. I was the rabbi, she was the cantor, and the idea was that the cantor was going to control the rabbi. And we had a whole script, but I could feel Susan in the back of my back, because I'm sitting on her, going like this, you know, while I'm talking. She's controlling me. It was a very, very funny skit. It was also the first time that Robin Joseph and Sonny Schnitzer sang together. And they, of course, later went on to write many songs together and record several albums together. But that's where it started. It started at the first retreat. The second retreat we had was at Eilat Haim. And I think it was the next year. So it was either 93 or 94, in that time. And Shohama came up to me and said, I'd like you to take over the Alumni Association, because up to that point, she had been in charge of the Alumni Association. And as well as being the dean and everything else, right? And I said, I don't know, Shohama, I want to do that. And she said, no, you really need to do this. And I'm thinking, I really don't need to do this. But I couldn't say no to Shohama. I owe Shohama a tremendous debt for her support while I was going through school and later on. And so I agreed. And so I remember asking her for the bylaws, because we were always talking about the bylaws, but no one had ever seen the bylaws. And we couldn't find the bylaws. And it was at that point that we began to work on new bylaws for a professional association as opposed to an alumni association, because it's kind of as part of the institutionalizing of the academy, which was going on at that point. We were trying very hard to, kind of under pressure by the CCAR and the HUC people who were saying not nice things about us, we were making a real effort to give the academy a similar kind of institutional structure to the other seminaries, to make it, not to make it more legitimate, it was perfectly legitimate, but to give it the outer coating that to the outside world would make it look the same as everybody else, no matter what our message was. The institutional, this was a discussion that Shoham and I and members of the board had for years about perception versus reality, what we needed to do to make the perception come into line with what everybody else was doing. And it was very, very hard, because the academy for so many years had run like a mom and pop shop. As a matter of fact, my first semester at the academy, we started the alumni association. We started the student association. We started the student association because Shohama would come to us, to all the students, and she'd say, "This is the budget. What do you think of it?" Because she had no one to work with. She only had us. And of course, we were not typical students. We were all in our 30s and 40s. We were people who had life experience, who had business experience. And so we had something to bring to the table. And so I'll never forget, she shows us this budget for the academy, and it's $35,000 a year. And most of that was for rent at Anshe Chesed. And we said, "Where's the line for faculty?" And she said, "All the faculty are volunteer." And we said, "No." All of us, the four of us who were sitting at this table with her, the whole student body, we said, "No." We said, "You have to pay the faculty. We'll never get anybody who really wants to make a commitment to this institution if it's not paid. It can't be volunteer faculty anymore." And so the students had a meeting. We formed ourselves as the student association, and the first order of business was to raise tuition. We voted a substantial increase in tuition so that the faculty could be paid. And that was really the beginning of the concept at the academy that there was a partnership between the administration and the students, and that it was not like at other institutions, the students are the consumers and the administration is the people who run things, that the students were stakeholders and had not only a right but a responsibility to the institution to give service and to have some oversight. Later on, that developed into, as our alumni organization began to take shape and have some real guidelines, first guidelines, then bylaws, and the bylaws went on for years until we got our bylaws passed. But as part of that process came the idea that there needed to be on the board an alumni presence and a student presence. And the idea of the student presence was something that was championed by the alumni. We felt that this concept of the stakeholder presence on the board was very, very important.
So you were there when everything was coming together as a unity, and yet it was also starting to shift a little bit. What was your ordination like?
In the beginning, when someone was ready to be ordained, ordination was at the congregation of the person who was ordained to be ordained at the time of year when the person wanted it. And it was individual ordinations, and I went to a couple of those. I went to Bernice Weiss's ordination, and we all went down to Maryland to her home congregation for that. And it was very nice, and generally the person who was being ordained arranged everything and paid for everything. There were several like that. And I'm trying to think, I think it was either my ordination or the year before that we finally prevailed on Shohama to only have one ordination a year, and for it to be in a place of the institution's choosing, or wherever we could find space. Basically, but it had to be a place where it was institutionally oriented, where the institution had a fiscal responsibility for the ordination, and that everybody else, and then we were still very small numbers. Even when I was ordained, I was ordained with two other people, with Toby Weiss and Joe Topek. And so there were three of us. That was a lot. That was the biggest class that we had, 3 people, right? And we had it at Temple Israel in New York because I knew the rabbi there. And they were willing to give us the space. And it was a beautiful space. And we had students, we recruited all the students who weren't graduating to do things. And I remember having long conversations with Shohama about, we need flowers. We need flowers to make it look nice. We need a photographer. The big arguments about the photographer for years. Every year we would argue about whether or not we needed a photographer, and usually she was prevailed upon to, in fact, we would get a photographer. Sometimes we got people who volunteered, sometimes we paid them, but it was just the idea. And I remember saying to Shohama at one point, we have to have this for our archives. You know, we had, just like you're doing now, we have to have this so that in the future we'll have a record of these things. And it was a beautiful, beautiful day, and I think the cantors sang, maybe the cantorial students sang. I don't remember. Honestly, it was, what I do remember most specifically, because part of it was a blur, as it can be, but I remember talking to Shohama about how we were going to do the actual ordination, because in the past it had been kind of not really formal. And I thought it should be some format that we would always use. And so the format that we developed was that one person in the Beit Din would stand behind you and put his or her hands on you, and then the 2 other members of the Beit Din would stand in front of you and bless you. And so Rabbi Zlotowitz was on my Beit Din, and he stood behind me, and he was what he was supposed to do was put his hand on my shoulders and say, "From where I stand, go forward." Now, you know, this is like before you're ordained and you're writing sermons at 3 o'clock in the morning because you can't sleep, right? And everything sounds like it's great, going to be great. We really didn't understand, I think, what it would be like to be the person who is the ordinee, having somebody who is such a powerful presence in your life saying, "From where I stand, go forward." It's very, very powerful, but how powerful, right? So we're at the ordination, and I'm up there, and Rabbi Zlotowitz puts his hands on my shoulder, and he says, he goes off script, and he says, "Joe." Now that he wasn't supposed to say my name, but he says, "Joe, from where I stand, go forward." And in that moment, I had this feeling of, first of all, from where he stands, I should go forward. Rabbi Zlotowitz, who knows everything, you know, the Prince of all knowledge and goodness and everything, I should go forward. I take this legacy. You know, the fact that he put my name in was so, it focused me in a way that I hadn't expected. And then also I felt like there was this big pit in front of me, and I thought, what have I done with my life? oh my God, what have I done? What have I done? What have I committed myself to? And it was, you talk about awe and trembling. That was awe and trembling. An amazing experience. One I wouldn't have missed, but certainly, perhaps a little bit too much drama, because they don't do it that way anymore. They've changed the formula a little bit. It's evolved over the years, and I think probably for the better. Although it's still a tremendously moving ceremony. I think moving for the ordinees, moving for people who are watching. That was quite something. So that was my ordination.
That's something. And you have the most beautiful document.
Yes, and I wanted to show this.
1 second?
Yes.
Just right before you show that. 2. Go ahead.
So I understand that you have a most beautiful smicha document.
Yes. There's a story behind this. This is my smicha document. My husband, Neil Yerman, at the time that I went to rabbinical school, was starting a career as an artist and a scribe. And in the early years of the academy when I was there, and even after I graduated for a number of years, whenever they needed something, a New Year's card or something filled in, Neil did it. He volunteered. And his big project was the smicha certificate, and I think this was the first year that he actually did the certificate. Because up until then, we had kind of, pre-printed things that weren't very attractive. And so Neil created these documents by hand. Each one was done completely by hand on calf skin with gold leaf, and they were in the academy colors, the maroon. And this was the academy's logo at the time, the burning bush. And he developed this with Shohama and some other people, and this was used for a number of years. Now, after a while, it became difficult for him to kind of keep up because we were graduating more and more people, and to do this by hand, this is a good day's work. And there was a lot to donate. And so they got the money together, and what Neil did is he printed they created all the things that are in maroon were printed, and then he continued to do all the gold leaf by hand. At some point, they stopped doing that, and they printed the whole document. And then, of course, there was I think during David Greenstein's time, they changed the logo, and so then they changed the document. But this is my document. I'm very proud of it. So I wanted to bring this and to show this because his contribution was significant. And at some point, I forget when it was, he was recognized, but and of course he went on to become a sofer. But I wanted to bring this because this is an important part of the Academy's transition into a more institutional model, to have a document that was the same for everybody, that looked nice when it was framed. And I have to say, having seen the documents for other institutions, this is the nicest of all the seminaries. I still think even what we have today is a beautiful document.
So you have received blessings along the way?
Yes.
And been a blessing along the way. What blessing do you have for AJR as it goes forward?
Oh, it's been so wonderful to see the Academy develop in the ways that it's developed over the last 15 years or so. Certainly, one of the things that I think about is a discussion that we had with Rabbi Maurice Davis of blessed memory, the father of our alumni, Michael Davis. In the beginning, in the early years, we would often meet at Shohama's house in White Plains when the weather was nice, and we'd get together for Sukkot or something like that. And I remember a time being early in my career there, maybe in 88, 89, sitting outside with Rabbi Davis and some other, and Michael, who was a student at that time, and talking about whether it was possible to admit students who were gay and lesbian into the rabbinic program. And I remember saying at that time, how could you ordain a rabbi who is gay or lesbian when Judaism is about family models? Because that's where I was then, in the late 80s. And Rabbi Davis said, no, no, no. He said, that shouldn't be a reason for somebody not to be able to study and become ordained. And I thought about that for a long time. Ultimately, of course, I came to understand the situation much differently, but that stands out in my mind as kind of a pivotal moment in the Academy's development. First of all, because we were having that discussion, and no one was having that discussion at that time. And because ultimately people who were gay and lesbian began to be admitted to the Academy shortly thereafter, with no big fanfare, which I think was appropriate, you know. And certainly before the CCAR was willing to ordain gays and lesbians, way before JTS was willing to have people who were out of the closet. And I think that the Academy's greatest strength through all these years has been the willingness to test the parameters of what is possible. The fact that we now have, we're now clearly well on track for Middle States accreditation is an amazing thing. It started when I was a student, you know, so it's taken a very long time, but to see that happen is a wonderful thing. To see the way in which, I read that, unfortunately I couldn't be there, I was teaching, but to see that 40 alumni came to the retreat, and that these retreats have grown every year, that the students have to go, that alumni want to go. So tremendously important. The fact that the Academy now has its own space, its own institutional space in a place where they are not beholden to any other institution. It's very important in terms of its institutional maturity. And if I had a blessing to give, it would be the hope that spirit of inclusiveness, of welcoming, of diversity, of pluralism would continue to guide the students, the faculty, the administration into the future.
Amen.
Yeah, thank you.
Baruch atah
Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh. Amen.